Thank you for the invitation. I'm Mehmet Soytas, and that's a joint work with George Gale and Limor Golan from WashU. So, pre-labor market human capital accounts for 45 to 90% of lifetime earnings, and that's kind of huge implications for inequality. And it accounts for 100% almost black-white female wage gap and 70% of the males gap. And we focus in this paper on the role of time investment, especially in the early childhood to children, and look at the educational outcomes of children and how it is affected through a structural model. So education affects both earnings and marriage market, and there's lots of associative mating, so spouse education and characteristics have large impact on consumption and welfare. So we analyze black and white gaps, and we find that there's large black-white achievement gaps, and then we also find that these gaps open early in the life cycle. And we try to understand the effect of family structure, marriage market, and the labor market on the extent of this gap. Okay, what we do, we provide a unified framework to account for the determinants of investment. So by that I mean the time investment and also the input from monetary resources. And we use data from PSID, and we use all the data we have from 1968 to 1997, and estimate cost and returns, and how they vary by race, gender, and education, and also household structure through single versus married households. And the model in general accounts for dynamic selection, so fertility and time allocation, decisions over the life cycle, so spacing of children and the labor supply, and whether the individuals through some part of their life cycle are single or married are all kind of accounted for. So the contribution can be said to quantify the effect of family structure differences, single versus married, and associative mating, so who marries whom in terms of their educational gradient, and look at the racial earnings gap and how it affects the racial achievement gap. So that's graph kind of. So we're going to use, I'm coming to that in a second, PSID, and PSID doesn't have a direct measure of time investment to children. So what we do is we kind of use a normalization framework and kind of get from the housework hours a measure for time spent on kids. And what we do is that there's a data source that actually looks at how much time individuals or the parents spend with their kids. It's from American Time Use Survey. So we kind of, in this slide, show the patterns that we obtain from PSID with that measure. It's kind of coincide with the results from American Time Use Survey. So what we see is generally married people spend more time with their kids compared to single people, and white married people spend more time than black individuals. Oops. It's hard here, I guess. Yeah. So the probability of being single for a parent with a child under 6 is 69% for black individuals, while the corresponding number is only 13% for white. So there's a huge difference here in terms of being single versus being married. And there's higher cost because when you're single, it's really hard to invest in your kid given the time constraint. And there's also returns can be lower. So we have different genders, and blacks versus whites can have different production technologies or the same technology but different returns can be captured with different parameters. But there's also marriage market differences that can also affect returns. So 63% of married white females with college degree have a spouse with the same education level, but the corresponding number is only 30% for blacks. And also probability of being single for a college graduate black female is more than twice the white college graduate white female. So marriage market definitely affects time allocation within the household. So and married black females, we also find that work more than white married females. So, but the opposite is true for males. So in addition, the racial earnings gap may affect time allocation within families. Okay, so this basically kind of showing the smoothed hazard of first marriage by race. So this graph is kind of for whites, and this graph is for the blacks. So why it's kind of conditional on, so by the name hazard suggests, not being married, what is the probability of being married in the next age after 18? So it's more likely for whites to get married. And once get married, what is the likelihood of getting divorced? And it looks like that blacks are more likely to get divorced even there once they get married. And also this pattern kind of shows here the assortative mating patterns, so who marries whom. And when we look at the college educated females, black females, that's the pattern what we see here. But when we look at the whites, we see that there's a huge assortative mating compared to blacks. So what does this paper do? So we use a model of dynastic altruistic households like Laurie and Becker and Barrow framework. But what we do is we kind of incorporate a life cycle component into that in each generation. And what we have in this life cycle, individuals can choose labor supply, fertility, and spacing of children, depending on this. And they can also marry and get divorced during the life cycle. And they also choose whom they are going to marry to in terms of the education level. And they're also, if they get married, then now we have a household, and we model this household decision through a non-cooperative game. Okay? And it's a partial equilibrium model. There is no, unfortunately, borrowing or savings. The only way to invest in the kids is through the human capital. That there's a production technology that time inputs and money inputs can be put in to produce a quality for the kid. And in this framework, preferences and constraints affect choices over the life cycle. And parents choose to allocate their time between different things that they can choose, like labor supply, time investment, or leisure at home. But time at home can be productive in the production function for better children. That's something that we empirically obtain. And there is fertility. That's something also endogenous in the model. That's not very, very common in generally. So people space their children. So they decide on starting from, say, age 17 when they are going to have their first kid, second kid, and so on. And obviously, when we have married couples, we have the household, and the household structure is modeled explicitly. And what we do is we allow transfers between household members. Okay, if I kind of show you the main results that we obtained in this paper, so the resource constraint explains the racial gap in parental time input. So that's basically the coming from two main sources. One is on the earnings part. The second, but most important one is through the marriage market. So we are going to kind of mention that in the results. So the composition of the source of racial gap, marriage markets, and earnings gaps in general, and closing the marriage probability gap actually increases educational achievement gap as it decreases father's time. So in our framework, in our estimation, we find that not only mother's time, but father's, yes?
To what extent is the marriage gap driven by earnings gaps? Right? So I'm thinking that if earnings are lower, perhaps the complementarity between man and woman might be lower. So you kind of marry less.
That's definitely an explanation, but in this framework, we don't model the marriage market endogenously. So what we take into account is, so partially we endogenize it. So we take into account the spousal characteristics, and there's a matching function that decides on who marries whom. So, but in terms of the decision, it's not a decision in the model. So, yeah, but that's the total.
The sorting that you mentioned before is kind of exogenous thing.
In the marriage market, that's what you mean.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
So we say the sorting of the model.
Right, but you will see in the counterfactuals, we say it's partially endogenous. The reason is for that is, so there's in the household composition, so it's like it's a game, and it depends on the best response function. So knowing that type, so marrying with that type, you can actually allocate resources differently. So that's to some extent endogenizing that effect. So, but definitely no, we are not taking it as a decision. Okay, so closing the marriage probability gap actually increases educational achievement because fathers this time spend less time with the kids and it increases fertility. That's one result. And change in matching probabilities and divorce rate had the largest impact on the racial gap in educational outcomes. So that improves it hugely. So closing the earnings gap, decrease education gap, and decrease fertility. So that's definitely another channel that's working. So impact on the income gap is different from impact on the educational gap due to effects on labor supply. So I can summarize the findings like this. So there are lots of literature that we use actually in this, coming to the end in this paper. So there are static models of household, starting with Becker, and collective models and cooperative bargaining models that we use in modeling. The intertemporal models of household and extend the static. So we are using a dynamic model, obviously, not a static one. But in terms of modeling the household decision, we have a non-cooperative game structure, and that's basically taking its roots from the modeling framework of Ligon, Thomas, and Voral. So contractual agreements, we are modeling it as a non-cooperative equilibrium of a repeated game that between spouses. And what we use as a result there is constraint efficient contracts as those which are not party dominated by any other sustainable contract. So that result helps us to, because in general, when you have a non-cooperative game, it's not guaranteed that you have an equilibrium, and you don't, given that you have actually a pure strategy equilibrium. But under some conditions that we can show that we have actually in this dynamic model. Okay, the other literature comes from the investment, parental investment accounting for time and money inputs. So there literature starting Bernal, Kang, Dalbocq and Finn, Wishfall, and Lee and Sheshadri, estimating the same question. But these papers don't account for the impact of endogenous fertility on outcomes, and they don't account explicitly for the marriage market and the assortative mating patterns. And there's also definitely a dynastic model that account for these factors, marriage, divorce, and two decision maker households, including Echeverria-Marlowe, Rios-Roll, and Sanchez-Marcos, and Greenwood, and Knowles, and Gunnar. But in those papers, time allocation or time investment with kids or assortative mating in some setting, or the effect on the children outcomes are not explicitly addressed. Okay, so the relative importance of pre-market skills in determining racial gaps in outcomes, there is a huge literature on that. So Cameron and Heckman investigate the source of racial disparity in college attainment, but we are going to exploit this mechanism. So we're going to look at the life cycle decisions and how they kind of aggregated in the production function will change the outcomes for the next generation children. Okay, that's all I mentioned here. Okay, let's come to data. So we're using data from PSID from 1968 to 1996. So PSID unfortunately measures annual hours of housework, but doesn't have an explicit measure for time investment unless coming from 1990s to CDS supplementary data. But we need generations of individuals, so because we want to observe the investment over the life cycle and how the effects will be on the children. So we have to stick with the main data file. And what we have done is kind of normalize a measure from housework hours and use that as a measure for time investment with kids. Okay, and we account for gender, education, and year while making the normalization. And if we have a negative value, we set it equal to 0. And we discretize at the end to 3 levels of investment, can be said low, medium, and high. Okay, that's our sample. Okay, so that's kind of the general properties of the sample. So we have annual time with children obtained from normalization. And it kind of follows the main patterns that we obtain from, as I said, American Time Use Survey. So more educated spend more time with the kids compared to less educated. and in terms of labor income, the wage rate. So we kind of obtain the expected results. Okay, let me mention the model. So I'm going to present first a genderless model. That means we are modeling single individuals, and how a single individual makes a decision will be captured through the genderless model. And then when we have a family, we're going to model the joint decision of the spouses. So in the genderless model, so we have infinitely lived generation. So that means we are actually estimating the stationary equilibrium. But in each generation, we have a constant amount of time that individuals can choose to choose different activities. So they derive utility from consumption, leisure, and from the utility of their offspring, from the children. Okay? And so they can make decisions in each period about fertility, about labor supply, and about the time input, time investment to the kid. Okay? But only the transfer that we take into account is the human capital one. So no other bequest or social transfers. And we assume that there is no borrowing and saving for simplicity. So in our model, children only consume. They do nothing else. But the adults make discrete choices about labor supply at 3 different levels. Time spent with the kids, and there's a birth decision to whether have a kid in a period. Okay? So we collect all the discrete choices into an index that kind of shows all the possible combinations of these choices, and obviously these are mutually exclusive in our setting. So we define a vector x that includes the time invariant characteristics of education, skill, and race of the individual, and we also have a state variable zt, and that collects all the past choices and also the x vector. So this indicator, about the choices, allow us as a proxy for this utility associated with labor market activities and home hours. So an example for that is spending the same number of hours working in the labor market, or on a combination of home hours and working, but the same total hours may mean different things in the utility function. So we are trying to capture that effect. Okay, so there's an earnings function denoted by W, depends on the state vector and the decision about participation part-time or full-time in the labor market. And there are 4 mutually exclusive outcomes for the offspring's characteristics, and that we model through the education level, which we say high school, less than high school, some college, and college. And there's a transfer function which we denote by M, and that's that cap t plus 1 is the life cycle and state variable of the parent, and that will kind of stochastically decide the education level of the kid in the invariant characteristic, not only education, starting his or her own life cycle. Okay. So Z cap t plus 1 also contains information on all birth decisions if there's a kid, so the spacing is important in terms of that, and it definitely captures the number of siblings and their ages.
How do the different investments in children, time or money, accumulate into those outcomes?
Here.
It's all in the M?
Right. So in each period, starting from the age 0 of the kid, so we only take into account like the Heckman type or Kuna type, the early childhood investments, and we take into account all the investments up to age 6. So after that point, so we don't assume, we assume that there's no investment. So this only captures the early childhood investments in that respect. And then if there are different children, then it also collects information about their investment patterns. And at the end of life cycle, that's all collected in the big vector. Okay, we normalize the price of consumption to 1. So raising children requires parental time and market expenditures. And how we model that through the budget constraint is the income or the earnings that the individual is either spent on consumption or on children. Okay, so So we don't observe in PSID again the consumption made on children. So how we model that is through this framework. So we said that it's proportional to the number of kids. If you have more kids, spend more money, and it also depends on the earnings of the individual. Okay, through some in the estimation through some exogenous characteristics or fixed characteristics, I would say. So this allows us to capture the differential expenditure on children made by individuals with different characteristics and incomes. And also it lets us to observe differences in social norms of child rearing among different socioeconomic classes, like education in our setting, practically.
So you cannot have a poorer family that decides to invest a lot in kids in terms of resources?
We don't find. You
cannot have. So the investment in kids is fully driven by earnings?
The monetary investments is driven by earnings, right? In the budget constraint, that's how we model it. But the pure family can still kind of substitute away from that and invest more time in kids. Yeah. But the way that we capture this is true. So that's kind of an empirical question in that setting. So in the estimation, that kind of shows the education, kind of vary through the education of the individual.
What is that?
That one is the state. So the past choices plus the race, education, and the marital status of the individual in that setting. Sure.
How do you deal with this whole dysfunctional black family? Is out of the family, the black voices. Is this part of the problem
It's better I come near to you so I can't hear.
There's this issue about black families.
Right.
Husband is gone, the wife, the mother can. Do you take this into account?
Right. Yes. So yes, exactly. So in this setting,
husband is not gone.
right. If the individual, so if there's a family and there's a birth that's attached to the mother, so in our setting, so this single individual can still decide to have a kid, but in this we will kind of see it better when we come to household part. But this income will change. So this is the individual income here. So this person can choose to have a kid and has to kind of spare this much of resources to the kid. That's how we model it, and that will only depend on her income. So, but if there's a household, that will be the household income in that part. So that's kind of important to model in our setting. So because there are many black single mothers, and they actually have kids, and they both make monetary investment and time investment, and that's how they do in our model.
Do you have any insight why the husband is not present? What's really the story? Why is it leaving the family? Is it because of dysfunction?
Okay, that's something that I was planning to come at the end, but because the marriage market is kind of driving many results in this setting, but there are different, so we are speculating on that, I would say, but there are different kind of theories about that. So about the marriageability of the black males actually in terms of, say, quality. So more single woman appears in the market than more white woman. And the other is about the social norms. So black females kind of find it less attractive right now to get married. And the third possible explanation could be the increase in social welfare programs that's kind of supporting the children. So
asking us economics reasons, whether there's therefore going to be some sample selection bias in all of the samples that you're looking at. In other words, if there are different stories related to unobservable characteristics that are correlated with the things that you're looking at that lead to this type of family structure, that's the economics of it, then the sort of trivial econometric problem is the sample selection bias. So it's not something one can look at, append afterwards, if that's what you're getting at.
is that the question? So
Well, that's what I'm getting.
okay. So yeah. Okay. Okay. So to the extent, so we are definitely, as I said, if I understand you correctly, not modeling the marriage market, but to the why there are more black females than black whites. So that's something about they cannot match that much. So that's exogenously taken from the data. So they cannot find the probabilities show they don't get that much merit, and if they get merit, they divorce more. But the explanation for that from the model, so we take that into account and then try to capture that. So we're trying to produce the same patterns from the data. So that's at the end depends on the kind of the definitely cannot explain since we are not taking modeling data endogenously why they are getting staying more single. But I can only speculate on that. So answers your question or? Okay.
Did you say alpha was a statistical relationship, or like, or were you constraining the optimization problem to have that form?
So here, so alpha here is kind of in the theoretical model depends on the past choices, but why we call here why we bring it to the data? That's what I'm saying. So what we are going to allow is that will depend on kind of the demographics. But
I understood that, but the proportionality, you could have constrained the decision rule, right, to have that form in the optimization problem, or you wasn't sure what exactly you were saying, or if you're just imposing some statistical relationship for the data.
Okay, that is something. Okay, from that point of view, I'm just imposing that. So that's what I'm saying. So since I don't observe consumption of children, yeah, maybe I should be clear about that. So what I'm doing is people spend that much proportion of their income on children, and that's linearly increasing with the number of kids for single individuals, and that depends on the earnings. Okay, yeah, that definitely that's. Okay, so adults from each generation have the same utility function assumption, though the utility from consumption on leisure is assumed to be additively separable, another assumption. So the utility from IKT, the choice made in a period, a systematic component denoted by U1 KT, and that depends on the state vector, and there's an idiosyncratic part denoted by epsilon KT. So the systematic component with discrete choice k represents an individual's net utility, period utility associated with this utility from different combinations of things that he or she can choose. And obviously, idiosyncratic component is the part that's not being explained by these factors. And there's a utility from consumption in a period. And we have altruistic preferences, so parents obtain utility from their adult offspring's expected utility. So we have two discount factors. One beta is more through the life cycle, and we have a kind of a discount factor to kind of discount the utility of the kids from the next generation. And that's kind of following the Becker-Barrow framework. We have lambda and the number of kids. Raised to the power 1 minus mu, showing that there's decreasing kind of returns from having children. And given the optimal choices about the model, an individual choosing I and C optimally in each period, so we said that the expected lifetime utility at time t0, that's kind of the adulthood starts, can be written as the expected value at that period of choosing different actions, and the associated utility is obtained by choosing those actions through the life cycle. Okay, but in our framework, this UG cap t is kind of the utilities obtained through own consumption, but we said that there's also a part, altruistic part, that individuals care about their offspring, and that's how we model it through the next generation utility, the next generation expected utilities of the kids. So in this kind of framework, in the estimation, we are going to exploit this structure, but theoretically, it's kind of consistently implying a kind of infinitely lived society where each generation kind of takes the same kind of choices, makes the same kind of choices in his or her generation. Okay, so household decisions. So spouses can make transfers, so trades for them are different from the single individuals. So that's how we model is through a simultaneous move game with an exogenous sharing rule, like similar to Blundell, Chiappori, and Meagher. And stochastic household formation and dissolution. So we have through matching functions. So marriages may not be stable. They can end up with divorce, or single individuals can get married. And in terms of technical part, the game that we're modeling is supermodular. A pure strategy Markov perfect equilibrium exists in this framework. And altruistic preferences in this setting implies positive externalities. So also all pure strategy equilibrium can be part of ranked Milgram and Roberts, and US conditions kind of apply. So the best equilibrium is a constrained efficient contract, as those which are not part of dominated by other contracts, as in Ligon, Thomas, and Roral. So contractual agreement as a non-cooperative equilibrium of this repeated game between the spouses whenever there is a family. So the household model is kind of very similar to the individual problem. We are modeling the utilities of each spouse, but so since we have two individuals right now, so we index them with sigma 1 and 2. 1 is male, 2 is female, and they have different choices. So we have the fertility choice, and we assign that to the female, and female makes the fertility choice. But male only makes the time investment and the labor market choices. And when we have a kid, we also keep track of the gender of the kid, and we also keep track of when he or she is born, and also the time investment made to the individual. Okay, so, and single parents who do not live in the same household with their children choose only labor supply and birth decisions. So there is no time investment when there is a different separate households. Okay, so the budget constraint of the married household is own earnings of the sigma individual plus a kind of a transfer, which can be positive or negative, and that's going to be going to own consumption and the consumption of the kids. But the consumption of the kids right now is proportional to the all household income. Okay. Okay, so married couples simultaneous move game. At the beginning of each period, both spouses observe the state of the state ZT, which collects the ZT for both individuals, sigma and minus sigma, and also observes the epsilon shocks. Okay? So after decisions are observed, consumption is allocated according to the sharing rule characterization. And in that setting, if we denote by I now adding the sigma index, is the kth element of the discrete Markov strategy profile at time t of the individual. And that kind of maps the state and the unobserved shock to a decision, to whether a decision about choosing this action. Okay. And if we kind of collect all this index through the life cycle, that's going to be a Markov strategy profile for the individual in period for that period t. Okay. So the strategies of both spouses can be denoted by this way, collecting by the I without the sigma index. Then the expected utility framework still applies that we actually develop for the single individual, but now it's going to depend the actions of the spouse, obviously, because the optimal decision will depend on the outcome of the simultaneous move game. Okay. Okay, so single versus married time constraints and income sharing are the differences. So what we know from the PSIDO and also in other data sets, more single black mothers are available than white. So if single mothers work more than married mothers, then marginal cost of time with children is higher for them. And married black and white females, if the spouse has lower income or education may work more, and income of spouse is a perfect substitute in production of children. Okay? So that can be also said racial differences in marriage market also exist. Okay? And male black and white females, blacks have lower wage in the data, even conditional on education, there is a racial earnings gap. Okay? And in terms of fertility, quantity-quality trade-off, higher market value of time to whites, it implies. Okay? So the estimation strategy is kind of a three-step estimation. Because it's a non-standard problem, what we do is, in the first step, estimate earnings equations and fixed effects for both generations, and estimate conditional choice probabilities and the best response probabilities. So depending on one spouse chooses something, the probability of the outcomes, choices of the other spouse. And we using in that the fixed effects as inputs. And estimate the intergenerational transition function, and marriage and divorce probabilities, all from the PSID. So the first one requires looking at at least two generations of data to estimate the M function. So the educational probabilities for the kids given the end of the life cycle state of the parents. And that's how we obtain that is through a three-stage least square procedure. I will come to the results, obtain a intergenerational transition function using that framework. And in the second step, we derive a representation of the ex-ante evaluation function, Vx0, in terms of the first stage estimations of conditional choice probabilities, best responses, transition function, and period utility function parameters. Okay? And then in the third step, we estimate the utility functions and the discount factors using a version of Hodge-Miller-Sanders and SIMIT simulation-based estimation using a GMM framework. Oops, sorry. Okay, that's the outcome of the production function estimation. So what we do is, so there's a base case for less than high school. So we estimate a linear one to kind of make it operational for the three-stage least squares. And what we have seen is both mother's time and father's time matters in our framework, but at different margins. So mother's time affect mostly the college outcomes, but fathers are more affecting the high school and some college outcomes. But both are kind of positive, and what the other thing we observe is females, so it's something we observe in the data already, are achieving more than males. Okay, that basically shows what the probabilities imply if we change the mother's education, father education, and time investment in the production function. So these are the probabilities associated with the outcomes of the kid. So the first is kind of, if we have a less than high school mother and a less than high school father, and there's no time investment, our production function basically says that the kid will be a high school graduate with or more with 80% probability, and will be a less than high school graduate with less than high school person with 20% probability. So that what we see is kind of it's increasing with the time inputs and education. The extreme case when we have college-educated parents with full-time investment, we see that almost exclusively they produce college-educated children. And kind of model fit outcomes for our model kind of match the data well in terms of blacks and whites. This kind of shows it for single males and single females here for black and white in terms of the labor supply. And here it shows it for the parental time and then the birth patterns. That's how we obtain it, is through simulating the once we obtain the optimal parameters, we simulate the model to produce data to compare it with the actual data. But what the interesting part is, we're going to trying to kind of understand the sources of this gap in black and white achievements, and to do so, we have actually have 4 counterfactual simulations. And look at the effects of those on the outcomes. So the first one is the labor market earnings gap. So that there's the kind of between blacks and whites. And in the first one, we kind of shut that down. So we kind of say if the blacks are kind of have the same earning function as the whites. And in the second one, the matching probabilities, that means we have seen in the data there's lots of assortative mating especially in the higher education group for whites, but there is not that intensive for the blacks. Suppose that we have the same matching patterns for the blacks as whites. Okay, and in the third one, we actually match the blacks' marriage probability as whites. And in the fourth one, we actually say the blacks kind of divorced at the same rate as whites. Okay? And we'll separately look at the effects on choices, effects on parental time investment, and effects on children educational outcomes, and then try to reconcile them and reach to a conclusion. Okay, so let me briefly say what we have found in this outcome for different policy simulations. So that this shows the earnings counterfactual, the matching, the assortative mating, the matching the probabilities of marriage, and that's matching the probabilities of divorce. So time input in children is lower for black mothers, and married black mothers spend more time with children than married white males. Sorry, married black males spend more time with children than married white males. So closing the marriage probability gap has the largest impact on closing the race gap in the maternal time input. Okay? And it reduces black fathers' time input to a level below that of whites, so and increases fertility. So it is at the end it's not clear what is the per child investment. So because both father's time and mother's time are important in the only mechanism to transfer in our model, the intergenerational human capital. So closing the earnings gap, so the first counterfactual, raises the potential income of both spouses, obviously, and reduces overall time with children due to a substitution effect, and the reduction of black female labor supply due to income effect, that males raise labor supply substantially in our results. And it also reduces fertility rates of black females substantially. And this is the outcome of input in children. So this is the total mother's time here, and this is the total average mother's time with kid, kind of normalize the effect of the fertility as a result of the policy change. And here we have the total father's time and the per child father's time. So two patterns raises here. So this is the black kind of the black mother's time with the kid per kid. And what we have seen is if we match the earnings distribution, it raises the time spent to kids of the black mother. Okay, and if we match the probability of marriage, actually it has the most effect in terms of average mother's time per kid. Okay, and on the father's side, what we have seen is the increases is kind of not that substantial, but when we have matching the earnings distribution, we increase the time father spent with the kids. But if we match the marriage probability, we actually decrease the time father spent substantially compared to the original number that we get from the model. So if we kind of summarize this, so change in matching probabilities raise mother's time per child and reduce father's time per child the most. So looking at the effect of closing the earnings gap on time per child, it raised mother's time and decreased father's time the least. Okay? So the result is unclear what is the total effect on children outcomes as a result of that. And the most kind of the important part is the educational outcome. So at the end, how the intergenerational transfers will be affected by these policies. So what we obtain is closing the marriage probability actually increase educational achievement gap. So the large reduction in father's time actually dominates the large increase in mother's time. So as a result, both are kind of important in the production function. But closing the earnings gap improved the educational attainments of black, and at the same time, income effect reduces fertility. So it further increases the effect. So at the same time, changing the matching probabilities actually had the largest positive impact on achievement. Okay? So remember, the matching probabilities is kind of the same assortative mating patterns of blacks and whites. And it modestly increased mother's time, but increased father's time the most, having this counterfactual. And decrease in the divorce probability had the second largest positive effect. So, and it improved stability of the family and improved achievement while reducing the fertility significantly, so working through both channels. And the patterns are kind of similar for if you kind of constrain your outcomes for boys or girls, but the girls' achievements, as we obtain in data, are always greater. Okay, this is the outcome for that table. And finally, the earnings outcomes. So educational achievement does not translate what we obtained is directly to earnings. So earnings depend on labor market experience and current labor supply, obviously. And closing the earnings gap increased the earnings to a level higher than that of whites. So that's what we obtained here compared to these two numbers. While changing the matching patterns had the largest impact on the educational gap, it actually increased the earnings gap. So that's kind of working in favor of educational gap, but in the earnings part, that's what we obtain. So kind of summarizing these results, closing the earnings gap will substantially reduce achievement gap in education and labor market outcomes. Okay? So there's a large literature on discrimination and debate on what is the source of racial inequality. And many argue that the gaps are due to pre-market skills and not due to discrimination. So we don't take a kind of a stand on that. So we're not saying that it's coming from either source. But what we have found is if there's this discrimination, we show that it can have an effect on pre-market skills through its effects on family and time allocation. That's what we actually document. Okay? And to our knowledge, this channel has not been explored that much in the literature. So what we have done in this paper is to summarize analyze intergenerational transmission of human capital and develop and estimate a model with endogenous single parenthood, time allocation, and quantity-quality trade-off. So black mothers spend less time input in young children is lower, and they are more likely to be single compared to the white counterparts. And what in married households, black women work more compared to the whites, and black males work less compared to the white males. So what we have found is both the family structure and the earnings gap are important sources of the racial achievement gap, but it is the associative mating and divorce probabilities that we obtained in our counterfactuals that contributes the most to the educational gender gap across generations. Okay.
When you change these, you give blacks the same sort of mating patterns as whites, did black males' time increase? Because I thought on your original slide at the beginning you showed that white males spend less time than black males.
That's right.
So now that result implies that blacks are even like spending more time than the baseline. And so then what's the difference between a black and a white if you give blacks the same sort of mating pattern as whites? Because you must be assuming now there's more black educated males, right, to give them this sort of mating pattern?
Right. So we are not exactly matching that. That's what you are saying, right? So the available.
No, I was just wondering how you got the result intuitively.
Yeah. So we were saying that what are the available. So you're asking these results and to lower the time investment by fathers when we match the same matching pattern. So it may actually affect so we are saying that it's going to match those associative mating patterns, but we're not saying anything about the matching probability. So whether they're going to marry or if they marry, it's still the same for blacks. So they can get divorced more often, even if they match to a college person, or if they kind of, okay.
So somehow they're to marry those wives, they have to put more work in your contract or something?
Maybe I will say.
That's fine.
Okay.
I can see it's common.
Okay.
Sorry, just clarification. So when you attribute the white matching probabilities to the black, you find that father's time per child increases for blacks or the opposite?
I think that's the right table you're asking. So when we have the same matching probability, you said, right? So father's time actually increased, right? So here, what we see.
So could you interpret that that in terms of different bargaining power. I mean, the problem of African American women is that they have a very skewed, they face a very unfavorable marriage market.
Right.
So basically here in this exercise, what you're doing is you remove this
barrier to them.
this barrier. So now even African American women, they can marry like a well-educated.
Definitely.
man
So
like
yeah,
Mehmet.
actually we can quantify that. We didn't, but we have this transfer function when we have a household. So we can actually measure from the simulation how much the transfer varies by this counterfactual. So whether it's increases. So it's kind of.
Because that would be a way to interpret this
Okay.
increase in father's time. So they have
No, definitely.
less, now they have less bargaining power because they are not so special any longer. So basically they have less bargaining power, so then they have to work more.
No,
I mean,
I-
also like
yeah.
in terms of household.
Yep. No, I agree. So I'm just saying that we can put extra evidence on that, like the way you think. So, but we didn't. So that's it, definitely.
Thank you.